Good morning. We have some folks with us live and in person here at St. John's Cathedral this morning. We have some folks joining us on our Zoom link, and potentially other folks who are with us who are just observing the class on the open Facebook page, and others who may look at this presentation later on when they are able to do so. So today we are so pleased to have Dr. Stephanie Crowder, the Reverend Dr. Stephanie Crowder, with us here today. And Stephanie is, you can tell us a little bit about your position at Chicago Theological Seminary, because it's an intriguing title, and maybe you could just spend a minute telling us about that. But the way that I encountered Stephanie's work was in this wonderful African-American New Testament commentary, for which she wrote the commentary of Luke. And I believe Professor Blount was one of the editors, who is one of the another wonderful New Testament scholar of great note. And so it's wonderful to have Professor Stephanie Crowder with us today. And again, could you tell us a little bit about your New Testament and culture position, which to me sounds so fascinating, before you begin? First of all, let's welcome Professor Stephanie Crowder.
Well, good morning where you are. It is afternoon where I am here in Chicago. Let me first of all, before I even begin, just give thanks to the Holy One, the Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer for this time of gathering. And so I begin by giving honor and glory and praise to the Almighty just for this opportunity. And so, as Mark has stated, the very Reverend Dr. Mark Kowaleski has stated, I am currently a professor of New Testament and culture at Chicago Theological Seminary. And that means many different things. It means that I am interested in ways in which the biblical texts themselves were formed and created out of a particular culture. Hermeneutics 101 says that in order to understand content, we have to understand context. And so that is part of that understanding culture. But I'm also intrigued in the ways in which biblical texts are engaged in our current day culture, whether that's in movies, literature, whether it's the arts, dance, music, you name it. You may have seen, I don't know, there was a Netflix series called Midnight Mass. And so a lot of biblical connections and imagery and points of engagement. So I'm always interested in ways not only around the kind of historical context or culture that produced biblical text, but I'm amazed at the ways in which biblical texts are still engaged in culture here in the 21st century. So that's the title of Professor of New Testament and culture. Let me say thank you again to Mark, the rector and dean of St. John's Cathedral. I'm very grateful for this invitation, for this opportunity. Thank all of you whose calling it is to guide and to nurture and to be in this sacred space called St. John's. I am always intrigued because one never knows the length and the longevity of one's scholarship. You just never know kind of the breadth, if you will. But my being here, I think, is really what any scholar imagines, that what I do in the academy would meet up with who we are here in the church. And so I am grateful again for this opportunity and look forward to our time over the next hour or so. For our time this afternoon, I wanted to consider the theme, When Simon Speaks. An African 3G approach to the Gospel of Luke. And if anyone has that first slide, that's what that first slide is. It's just the title, if you will. And I think the title aligns with Black History Month, but also aligns with what I was told as part of my assignment is the celebration of Absalom Jones Day, as we honor the first Black man ordained as a priest in the United States. And so I would like for our time to proceed in, I guess, 3 movements or 3 phases, if you will. And so I'll lecture a little bit, then we'll have time for just a little dialogue conversation. I'll lecture again, little dialogue, and then final lecture, and then some dialogue and conversation. And so let us begin. In his sermon, a Thanksgiving sermon, preached January the 1st, 1808, African Episcopal at the African Episcopal Church at St. Thomas, hear these words from Reverend Absalom Jones. Jones said, "Let us conduct ourselves in such a manner as to furnish no cause of regret to the deliverers of our nation for their kindness to us. Let us constantly remember the rock whence we were hewn and the pent whence we were digged. It becomes us publicly and privately to acknowledge that an African slave ready to perish was our father or our grandfather." Jones's sermon is indicative of his time. The language is not inclusive, and yet the sermon goes on to note the idea to destroy false religions which pervade Ethiopia. And so there's a lot of context in this sermon from 1808. Yet this sermon from Jones is replete with references to Africa. We can stop there with the slide. So I'll let you know when to move forward. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Let's go back one. Yes, let's stop there. Jones did not leave behind the continent that is people, and that our people were coerced to leave. So on this Absalom Jones Day, permit me to reconsider an African father and grandfather patriarch, one Simon of Cyrene. History records that Jones learned to read, exploring and I'll put in parentheses the new, but exploring to read the Testament. And so my sanctified imagination allows me to posit that surely Absalom Jones must have come across this African ancestor in the biblical text. And so I want to spend our time focusing on Simon of Cyrene and just one verse, as you see there on the screen. Matthew and Mark write of Simon of Cyrene as being the father of 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus. But as you see Luke's version, Luke depicts Simon otherwise. And you have on the screen the way in which Luke, in Luke 23:26, describes Simon of Cyrene. And this is my own translation from the Greek. "And as they led him away, having laid hold on a certain Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country, they put on him the cross to bear behind or following Jesus." All we have is one verse, just one verse, and it's a loaded verse. So loaded that my dissertation of 200 pages pivots on just this one verse. And contrary to popular belief, you don't have to say much to say much. In this one verse, Luke tells us about who Simon is, where Simon is from, what happens to Simon, and what Simon does, all in one verse. Luke sums up Simon's past, present, and future. Yeah, one verse. And again, you don't have to say much to say much. So for the time that is ours to share, I want us to look at Simon because he's often overlooked. We get so busy hurrying up to the glory and perhaps the gore and the gory details of the cross that we rush through the journey, the road, the Via Dolorosa. And we cannot gloss over the fact that a Black man, someone of African descent, bore the burden of Jesus's cross on his back. It was an African who helped Jesus to carry the cross. And so I want to divide our study into 3 parts. I want us first to look at Simon of Cyrene, this idea of geography. Then we'll talk about Gorgic, or Simon coming from the country. And then third, we'll talk about the good or the glory, the idea of bearing the cross, if you will. So what does it mean to be from Cyrene. And I know there's some folk who are saying they're excited about talking about an African presence in the Bible, but others are already ready to log off or shut down the computer. Why do we need to hear about Africa or Africans or African Americans? What has that to do with being saved? What does race have to do with our salvation? What does our sociology have to do with our soteriology, if you will? I mean, Jesus loves everybody, regardless of ethnicity or race. Well, you're right, Jesus does. God is a universal God that speaks to us in whatever skin we are in. And the beauty is that, yes, God made us to be in the skin that we are in, and we ought to celebrate that. But this country doesn't always love Black people, doesn't always care for people of color. Ask Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Bryce, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The members at St. George's Episcopal Church didn't really love Black people. Doesn't church history, Episcopal history read of Jones and even William White being pulled from their knees while praying? Was not the balcony that Richard Allen and Jones and the Black congregants of St. George's, they thought they were building something to make the church more inclusive, but unbeknownst to them, it was really designed to exclude and to separate them from the white parishioners. So what does it mean to be from Cyrene? Well, here's what African-American poet Countee Cullen says in his poem, Simon the Cyrenian Speaks. He never spoke a word to me, and yet he called my name. He never gave a sign to me, and yet I knew and came. At first I said, I will not bear his cross upon my back. He only seeks to place it there because my skin is Black, but he was dying for a dream. He was very meek, and in his eyes there shone a gleam. Men journey far to seek. It was himself my pity bought. I did for Christ alone what all of Rome could not have wrought with bruise of lash or stone. Countee Cullen's poem presents a Simon who struggles with carrying the cross of Jesus, yet this Cyrenian helps Jesus because he senses something about his cause. Simon takes pride in what he does in his act of compassion. And so what does it mean to be from Cyrene? What's this 3G approach? Well, the first G has to do with geography. Can we go to the next slide, please? What does it mean that Simon speaks of geography? Having seized a Cyrenian, Cyrene in the Greek, or Cyrene, actually means the place of the iris. It is the current day country of Libya. The capital of Cyrenaica was known to have grain and wool and cattle and wines and Syphium, this medicinal plant. It was replete with wool and wine and horses, and yes, Syphium, a medicinal plant. It's not surprising that this African region, which was founded in about 631 BCE, was also a place where there were many non-Greeks and many Jews. According to Black historian Frank Snowden, many of these Cyrenians, who were sometimes called Ethiopians, had many Negroid characteristics. Snowden goes on to record that there was some unrest between Jews and Greeks in Cyrene around 87 BCE. Many Cyrenians received Roman citizenship from Augustus, and a larger number received this civitas under Claudius and Nero. The Jewish historian Josephus notes that there were acts of turbulence, if you will, in Cyrene at various stages. This place that was full of Greek culture also had Jewish overtones. There was a lot of internal political and social turmoil that began around 7 BCE and that will last really until the 2nd century CE. Luke mentions Simon, a Cyrenian in the gospel. And notice this place, this area is the farthest of any of the cities that Luke mentions in the Gospel of Luke. If you think about Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Samaria, Nain, Emmaus, Tyre, and Sidon. They're all within a certain geographical span, if you will. And there's this sense of distance, if you will, the sense of outsider, the sense of marginalization. It's this kind of, yes, the first G, this theology of geography, if you will, that perhaps Simon is a kind of distant person, an ethnic outsider. Not only does Luke mention Cyrene in the Gospel of Luke, but we also contend that Luke mentioned Cyrene in Luke's second volume, Luke Acts. So not only did Luke write the Gospel of Luke, but Luke also is noted to have written Acts of the Apostle. So as we have Cyrene mentioned with Simon of Cyrene in Luke, we also have Cyrenians who are noted in Acts of the Apostles. They are noted as being present at the day of Pentecost, chapter 2, verse 5. There was a freedman synagogue that had Cyrenians, mentioned in Acts 6, 9. Luke also mentions in chapter 11, 20, that Cyrenians are fleeing Jerusalem after the stoning of Stephen, and that they share the gospel with the Hellenists at Antioch. Luke also introduces Cyrenians who became Christians and had to leave Jerusalem because of their beliefs. Now, I'm not trying to say that all Cyrenians were Jewish, although Luke doesn't have any trouble naming Jews. He specifically names, he or she names Anna as a prophet of the tribe of Asher. So again, Luke has no issue naming persons of Jewish descent or lineage. But I think what the author is trying to do with Simon of Cyrene, that Simon is an African from a far away or distant place. Simon is connected with a city, a nation not close to Jerusalem. Simon comes from a distant area and endures violence to his personhood. Yes, this theology of geography has also to do with ways in which Simon's name is a foil, if you will, to other Simons in Luke Acts. Yes, we have Simon of Cyrene. We also have Simon Peter or Simon Bar-Jonah, who is named according to family. There is Simon the Pharisee, named according to political party. There is Simon Magus, Simon the magician, who is named according to his profession. And yes, we have Simon of Cyrene, who is identified according to geography. 4 different persons named Simon, if you will. Simon Peter represents persons who struggle with their Christian belief. Simon the Pharisee is indicative of non-believers who are just trying to understand. Simon Magus is a new follower of Christ who, well, can't get rid of his old bag of tricks, if you will. And then, yes, there is Simon the Cyrenian, who perchance represents the extent to which the gospel must be told. And so what do we do with this Simon of Cyrene? What does it mean to be, from Cyrene? Well, it means that Christ and culture go hand in hand, that my belief and my Blackness are in conversation, that your redemption and your racial identity sojourn. What does it mean to be from Cyrene? It means that there is something about home. There's something about geography. It means that there's a lot to be said about where we are from, about where we are really from. And I know I ended that statement with a preposition. It means that, yes, we may be living in California now, but where are our people really from? Yeah, Tina Turner was from Nutbush, Tennessee. That Black scholar, African-American scholar and genius, Benjamin Elijah Mays, was from a place called 96, South Carolina. Dolly Parton, she grew up in a place called Locust Ridge, Tennessee. Meryl Streep was from Summit, New Jersey. Viola Davis from Rhode Island. John Legend from a place called Springfield, Ohio. What does it mean to be from Cyrene? I'll stop and I'll pause here. Well, I think Absalom Joan reminds us that we can't discount our lineage. Jones did not discount his African heritage. And as we serve and as we share and as we minister, we have to take the time to assess and interpret our own identity. So I'll pause for a few minutes as we ponder the questions. Where are you from? I mean, really, where are you from? Go to the next slide, please. Who are your people? What's your Cyrene? What's your Simon identity? Anybody want to offer a thought, or I'm happy to proceed? I'll keep moving.
We have a couple
I'm
questions.
sorry.
I'm originally from Chicago. That's where my people are from. A lot of my family is still there. And it's interesting because I grew up, although I'm African American, I grew up Roman Catholic. So it's a real interesting way of being, because I've visited the Black church in Chicago and didn't particularly feel a part of it. But I can go to a Roman Catholic church there and feel very much a part of it. Here, when we moved here, I was like 12. And that's where I really became acquainted with the Black church, with the African American church here in Los Angeles, in a non-denominational church. So that part is home for me too. That's where I found how to worship in the fullness of my African ancestry, basically.
Hi, and thank you so much. You're just a dream. I also was born in Chicago. Excuse me. I am considerably older than she is. I'm over 75. I'm admitting no more than that. My paternal people are from Mississippi, and my maternal people are from Louisiana. So, you know, you get a lot of, it was interesting. My mother's people were Episcopalians and my dad's people were Baptists. So I am a Baptist Episcopalian or an Episcopalian Baptist. I'm not sure which is the correct, probably an Episcopalian Baptist. So occasionally we went to Sunday school. Well, no, regularly we went to Sunday school at least a couple times a month with my grandparents, excuse me. So I got to hear a choir. I didn't know it was a gospel choir. I just got to hear a choir of these Black adults. Not only was it just the singing, but it was the way they came into the sanctuary. They marched in and they clapped their hands and they raised their hands in praise to God. So I got to see a very earthy religion. And then I got to see the beautiful formality of the Episcopal Church. But one real quick anecdote was, I think I was about 8, and there was a gospel concert at my paternal grandparents' church. And so my grandmother had us come. She has 4 granddaughters. And a woman sang that was so stunning that even as a kid, I knew she was special. And my grandmother leaned over and said, "Do you know who she is?" And I said, "No, but isn't she wonderful?" It was Mahalia Jackson. And I was 8. I didn't know who Mahalia Jackson was. And of course, I didn't appreciate it till much later. But as a child, But I think that's how close a Black church was, that we embraced our even our famous people. We embraced them as our own, because actually that's really what we had in community. If we didn't have safety anyplace else, when you went to church on Sunday morning and you went to Sunday school, the job of that Black church was to give you Jesus as your Christ. That was their job.
Yes.
Hello, Jamila Rose. And my mother is from the Chicago, Detroit area too. And so like my grandfather, he was a somewhat famous jazz musician. And back in those days, you know, when our Black community, when our colored people, when we traveled, they didn't have places. We would call the musicians that lived in that area. So my mother remembers lots of jazz musicians sleeping on the couch on the weekend and being over there in the house. And it was so wonderful, you know. And things have changed a little bit, but I think realizing where I'm really from is cielo, is heaven, you know. And I think there's a part of me that I can share that with everybody, that we have a heavenly Father. You know, I had to realize that about my parents and my children, that they have a heavenly Father as well as I do, that is in their life. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I think
Thank
that's,
you all.
Anybody else? No? Okay. I'm not from Chicago, by the way.
Thank you all for your stories. Yeah, where are we really from? I live in Chicago, but Memphis, Tennessee is home for me. So thank you all. This first G, yeah, this theology of geography. Let's go to the second part, and let's go to the slide. And so there's our text. So we just talked about this theology of geography. And now we'll talk about part two, this transitioning from the Gorgic, transitioning from the Georgic, transitioning from the country. And they laid him, as they led him away, having laid hold on a certain Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country. They put on him the cross to bear behind Jesus or following Jesus. I'll begin with another poem from another Black scholar and artist and person that you need to know, not only in Black History Month, but in every month. So with part one, you had a poem from County Cullen. I begin with Dr. Anna Julia Cooper's poem on Simon of Cyrene. Dr. Anna Julia Cooper was the fourth Black woman to earn a PhD. And we can go to the next slide and you'll see an image of Dr. Anna Julia Cooper in her regalia. And this is Dr. Anna Julia Cooper's poem on Simon, a part of it rather. It's a very lengthy poem. Here are just a few lines from that poem. Beside the road to Calvary, a swarthy figure stood, Simon of Cyrene, alone amid the crowd, his brawny arms new burdens, his big broad shoulders bent, to many a loving service, a willing hand lend. It's interesting, sort of like Cullen, you have this Simon who willingly gives and willingly shares. And I'm going to problematize that a little bit later. Simon of Cyrene, a Cyrenian coming from the country. So Luke has many occasions when people enter the city of Jerusalem. You know, Mary and Joseph, they go to present Jesus in the city, in the temple. The Samaritans rebuke Jesus and the disciples, the road to Emmaus. So all of these occasions where people are entering Jerusalem. Luke doesn't state why Simon is coming from the country into Jerusalem. Joseph Fitzmyer says, well, if Simon is a Jew, perhaps he's there to celebrate Passover. Luke doesn't say that. But whatever happens, the city becomes a place of violence for Simon of Cyrene. It's interesting, this concept of city almost sounds like our modern day description of cities. We think of school shootings and murders and, limited service only in certain areas in the cities. Cities can become a place of unrest and dis-ease, if you will. It should not be lost on us, and I'm sure you know this history better than I do, that Jones established St. Thomas Church in the heart of Philadelphia. Its precursor, the Free African Society, was in an urban setting ravaged with yellow fever and poverty. And it's odd how a benevolent organization that both Jones and Allen established to meet physical needs, to meet economic needs, became a church to attend to, spiritual growth. That's this kind of genre, if you will, or typology, if you will, that meeting the physical and the economic needs first, that sort of led to a means of meeting the spiritual needs in the city, in the heart of Philadelphia. In the Bible, Luke paints the city of Jerusalem as a place of conflict. The disciples are arguing over who's going to be the greatest in the city. There are two swords. What are they talking about swords? The disciples with two swords. Who's going to cut off somebody? Peter cuts off a slave's ear. The temple police approach Jesus with swords and clubs. So you get the picture. There's this kind of angst and anxiety in the city. And in the midst of all of this physical and verbal violence, here comes Simon of Cyrene from the country, what is to be deemed a place of peace, into the city, this chaos. And many of us, some of you just shared, you grew up in the city and we know about the city. Wouldn't trade city living for anything. We love the hustle and the bustle and the noise and the coming and going. Sometimes you can tell people are from the city by the way they talk, by the way they walk, by the way they dress. You just look like you've been in the city. And so, there are advantages, yes, more jobs, transportation, better access, better opportunities. Nothing wrong with city living. There are advantages, and then there are disadvantages also of being in the city. And so we have these kind of ways in which there's this polarization, even within the city. Luke creates this polarization with city and country, and we sometimes see this polarization between urban and rural, city and country. Go to the next slide, please. Luke says that Simon comes from the agru, the agros. It's where we get our word agriculture, if you will. This word can be interpreted as coming from the field or coming from the country. And I couldn't help but think about the Aesop's fable of, the city mouse and the country mouse, this kind of division. And so Luke creates this way in which identity and this dilemma and this polarization between city and country. Notice, as I stated in part 1, we have named cities, Bethlehem and Nain and Bethany and Bethphage and Tyre and Sidon. But the country is just the country. No name. It's just, a place, an area. We don't even get the sense that there's plowing or farming. It's just Simon coming from this kind of nebulous, nameless place, if you will, or area. This country, this nebulous place. Some of you are, you're in the city by way of the country. Some of us are from places that MapQuest is like, what? Google Maps can't even locate it. you're living in LA, Hollywood, Inglewood, I don't know, Baldwin Hills, Sherman Oaks, Malibu, but no, you're really from Mississippi, Missouri, Alabama, from these Georgic, if you will, these, yes, Georgic parts of Georgia, maybe. Many of us are from the country, the place where the neighbor is 4 or 5 miles down the road. When it's dark, it's really, really dark. The country where Big Mama and Granddaddy lived, and every Sunday we had to go out there and pay our respects. Simon of Cyrene left the country, went to the city. This African ended up in Jerusalem. Simon of Cyrene left his native country of Cyrenaica, or current day Libya. He left his native country and traveled to Judea, left country rural living and went to the city of Jerusalem. Simon transitions, from this, second G, this Georgic, this place of that's not known, this place that's nebulous, this place of comfort, if you will, and goes into this city, the city that Luke paints that is filled with chaos. Simon leaves comfort for this place of chaos. We too become perhaps too comfortable, too complacent. We can easily get too attached to circumstances. So every now and then, God has to move and remove us. We don't know why Simon leaves the country and goes to the city. And sometimes we don't know how we end up where we end up, or why we are still where we are still. And so the divine moves us and removes us. And so I think that's why we have to be careful not to get too attached in our worship service, not to get too attached in our revivals or prayer meetings or in our lessons. It's easy for us to stay in one place. But this COVID conundrum, friends, has taught us not to be complacent with places. This pandemic predicament continues to instruct us not to get stuck on the sanctuary. We can't be too comfortable in the known places all the time. We just can't stay in the country. There is work for us to do in the city. I mean, how do we keep worship going? Via Zoom. How do we keep the ministry moving forward via Restream? How do we keep pushing forward with Bible study on Facebook Live? We can't stay in the country too long. The legacy of Absalom Jones reminds us that we've got to go and dwell in the city. For in the city, there are people who are hungry and hurting and who are in need of care and compassion. What does it mean to be from the country? What does it mean to transition through the Georgic, through the country? To be from the country means that God has brought us from something to something. It means that you have a story, that I've been on a journey. To be from the country means that either by force or by choice, you've left that which was familiar, comfortable, and known, that you came to that which was foreign and sometimes chaotic and unknown. To be from the country means that you gave up something so that someone could have something. To be from the country means that road was not always easy. And yet, like Langston Hughes says in his poem By Simple, he says, we are still here. What does it mean to be from the country? It means the hymn writer perhaps is right, that I can hear my Savior calling. I can hear my Savior calling, take the cross and follow me, that where God leads, I will follow. I'll go all the way. The next slide, please. So this transitioning through the Georgic, where is the Holy One calling you to shift? What's the rule, the country area that the divine wants us to leave for city or urban dwelling? Perhaps the Holy One is calling us to leave some people. I'll pause and see where our dialogue takes us.
I see something different in your second question, where it says, what country rural areas does the divine want you to leave for city urban dwelling? It sounds more like this to me. What peace and comfort does the divine want me to leave to take a chance on something more challenging, maybe more compelling, even a little more dangerous? What is the work I am being called into?
Margaret, did you have a thought on that question as you reframed it?
Well, the where's the Holy One calling you to shift? That would be the shift. But that work, that country rural, that sounds more to me like get out of your safety spot, get out of your place where you're just, you may not even know you're doing nothing, but you're just kind of gliding along, and get up and get busy, because God has work for you to do. And it's not sitting on your front porch in my rocking chair where I am supremely comfortable. And whom do you need to leave? Do you know, sometimes I need to leave myself, my comfortable self, my content self, even myself that says, you've been a long time on this journey, sister. And so maybe you feel like you ought to rest, but maybe that is not God's plan for you. Whom do I need to leave? Yeah, sometimes I just need to leave my picture of myself. Now you've scared me.
Yeah, and that's why it's in quotes, you know, the quote country rule, the quote city urban. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, someone was going to speak, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. I was born in Inglewood, by the way. I had to leave somebody behind because where I was from a town called Lancaster, which is the most northern part of the LA County, and it's still kind of country. It's been urbanized, but it's still very spread out like a desert. And coming to Los Angeles, I found this church here, and I'm very blessed. But I know there's something else more I need to do, and I'm really, really fearful. And so I'm just trying to align myself with the will of God and to have him lead me in the steps of righteousness for his name's sake. And it's not impossible, but it's not always easy. But that's, I guess, thank you.
Father Mark, could I say something?
Oh, yes. That's also, thank you, Russ, for anybody who is also on the Zoom link who wants to speak, do exactly what Russ just did. And unmute yourself and speak. So go ahead, Russ, please.
Okay, thanks. You know, I just have to stick this in. I was born and raised in San Francisco, which is a very liberal city. Spent my whole life there for many, many years. Went to San Francisco State, which was a school in which there was always something going on. We thought we were very progressive and liberal, but I might as well have been living in Death Valley. in terms of understanding the city as being the United States and what people who don't look like me go through and where they've come from. And we didn't have the vaguest idea. And it wasn't that we were mean or cruel. It just, until I got well out of college, it just wasn't there. So I live in this beautiful, liberal, heavily democratic city. I might as well have lived in Death Valley in terms of thinking about America as the country, all of America. And we didn't really even understand the depth of what Jim Crow did. We got it up in our heads, but, and that's just because I grew up where everybody looked and talked like me. That's it. Thanks.
Is there anybody else in the Zoom universe there today with us live that would like to share anything? I think, I'll just add something. What's resonating with me about this question is where this church community, or maybe many of our church communities, are having to go from, if we're framing this from the comfortable to the uncomfortable. And whom do you need to leave even? I think this church, and I think we're not alone, is having to reinvent itself after this time. And all those people who used to, I read a somewhat disturbing article from a pastor, but it's also, I think, really true. He said, pastors, they're not going to come back. Those people who were in the practice of church going because they were churchgoers, they're out of the habit and they're not going to take it up again. So what are you going to do? How are you going to preach the gospel to the group of the remnant that's there who get it? This is an opportunity, and for the church to become more the church. And so that's scary. And in terms of whom do you leave, we may be leaving some of those folks because they just aren't here. And so, and that's a scary thing, so I guess that'd be how I'm responding to what you had to say.
I was also thinking about when you mention a shift, it's almost like looking at yourself and saying what you think is good really isn't good, and having to give up what is comfortable and kind of go through a period of chaos. And that's very scary because you can't pull on what you know. You could go back to it, but it might mean you'd be stuck forever. And it's easier to be stuck than to move on. It's very difficult to give up what you feel comfortable with.
I can second what you just said, because I am here at St. John's after being in the Baptist church for 40 years. And I was incidentally became a part of the Baptist church because I was Catholic, marrying a Baptist, and I refused to sign that I would raise the kids Catholic. So I couldn't marry in the Catholic church, so we married in the Baptist church. And just because my husband's family was more entrenched in their church, I became a part of that community. And it really is a family, a community, as Margaret was saying. And I stayed there for 40 years. Yeah, so who did I leave? I left so many people. I left my husband there. He's still there, right? And, but I couldn't stay. And I knew for myself that there are many others who would like to, who are not happy with what's going on, but yet they're entrenched. The families are entrenched in the church, and so they stay because this is what they know. And it was what I knew for 40 years. And I just finally got to a point where okay, I know this, but I can't live it anymore. And I had to leave. And thank God, I came to St. John's. I left one Sunday. I turned in my, resigned from that church one Sunday, and the following Sunday, I came to St. John's, and I've been here ever since. And I've found family here. I had friends here. That was part of my my reasoning for coming here, because I knew some people already. It wasn't like starting over, trying to decide where will I go from, after 40 years, my family, everybody, my children were baptized in that church, were born and baptized and married in that church and whatever. But I knew that I had to go. And so it was hard, but I don't regret it. And I'm happy to be here at St. John's.
Well, I think for me, the pull is you want to get, like you said, comfortable in a certain place and a certain home and so forth. And, you forget that actually heaven is your home and you're actually on a journey there. And so that you're always being kind of pulled to, just have put all your interests in the comfortable and the recreational life, and not to think and to. So that's one thing that's nice about coming to church. It can remind you at least once a week that actually you can be braver, and that heaven is actually your home, and that's where you're journeying to. So you can take some risks and not just sit down in the country.
When you were saying about where do you have to leave from and go to, and that there are people in the city who need us, that's kind of been my life, I think, always looking to see who needs me. And, I first as an RN and then as a priest, my whole life has been about that. And now I'm in the midst of a health challenge, and where God has asked me to leave from is the place of being the one who takes care of people and who asks who needs me, where am I needed, and to be in a position where I have to accept someone else's care and ministry to me. And that has been really uncomfortable. And so sometimes, sometimes there are those kinds of leavings. It's leaving who you see yourself to be, and being called to understand yourself in a different way. And so that's been a bit of a challenge.
Thank you all for sharing and for being so vulnerable. It's transitioning through. Transitioning through. We haven't gotten there. We're transitioning through, and all that comes with, yes, transitioning through. And again, thank you all so much for sharing, and we honor the sacredness of this space now, being able to hold these stories. Thank you so much. Let's go to part 3. Let's go to the next slide. I think you've probably seen this slide. It should be at least the third time by now. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to thank Kelsey for agreeing to do this at the last minute. So very grateful for that. We still here?
We had lost the connection momentarily. We're back now.
Okay. Well, oh, okay, there we go. The next slide, it should be the text. So it'd be slide number 9. There we go. We'll stop there. So we've seen this slide 3 times now, but here's the last part that we want to highlight. So this 3G approach, Simon of Cyrene, our theology of geography, Simon of Cyrene from the country, transitioning through the Georgic, and then Simon of Cyrene. What does it mean to be a cross-bearer? Traversing to good, traversing to glory, traversing to good, traversing to glory. I couldn't decide. So I'll let you decide, you and your hermeneutical engagement, and you decide. As they led him away, having seized a certain Simon of Cyrene, excuse me, coming from the country, they laid on him the cross to bear, following behind Jesus, having seized a certain Cyrenian. Not just a cross bearer, but a forced cross bearer. What does it mean to be conscripted? What does it mean to be made to bear the cross? Luke, it's clear that Simon does not freely carry the cross. He is physically made to do so by they, if you go all the way back up to the beginning of chapter 23, they would be soldiers, would be Roman officials, Roman military who press Simon into service. This idea of pressing into service was a common activity among the Roman military. But not only was such physical conscription a part of the Roman, quote unquote, Pax Romana, or peace of Rome, but spiritual conscription in the sense of persecution sometimes of those who didn't worship Roman god systems or mythology could also be a part of society. And so we consider physical duress and also spiritual duress in Luke, and also in Luke Acts, because again, remember, we contend that Luke also wrote Acts. So Luke as the author of the Gospel of Luke, and Luke as the author of Acts of the Apostle, that we see, yes, this physical conscription and this spiritual coercion, if you will. Physical force. Let's go to the next slide, please. What is interesting is the shift in the change in the Greek word that Luke uses. Luke uses epilambano, if you will, and the word, it means to lay hold of, or to lay one's hands on, or to bring in one's sphere, if you will. Luke uses this word epilambano some 12 times, and at least 9 times it's used negatively. So 12 times, and then at least 75% of the time it's used negatively, having to do with somebody being verbally trapped or physically beaten. Notice the word at the top that Matthew and Mark use. Matthew and Mark use the word agoreo, which means to force or to press into service. This word is more closely associated with the Persian term, the angareia, which was the idea of denoting impressed labor or forced labor. Luke tries to soften it a little bit. Luke has this interesting way, and I think Pastor Mark and I talked about this. Luke has this thing with subversive language. And so he changes the language just a little bit, but we still get this idea of being forced and pressed, or this idea of Simon being coerced to do something that Simon would not have otherwise done. You get this reference of conscription in Luke 9, 2-4, where it says, take nothing on your journey, no bag or bread or anything like that, or extra tunic. The idea that Roman soldiers on military excursions, they took little with them because it was expected that they would overstay their welcome in households and pillage households as well. And so you have this idea of Luke kind of subversively saying, don't do what they do, meaning don't do what the Romans do. You also get this sense of rejection and conscription further down in Luke 9, with this whole story around the rejection of the Samaritan village. And so the Samaritans reject Jesus, and what the disciples respond, well, let's just burn the whole city down. But, Luke is saying, okay, it's really more kind of digging in the eye of the Roman military, because that's what Romans would do under their quote, Pax Romana, or their Roman peace. So you get this idea of spiritual conscription or spiritual force, or excuse me, a physical force or physical conscription. But there's also spiritual force and spiritual domination. If we go to Acts 12, it opens up with Herod Agrippa I, who's the grandson of Herod the Great, laying violent hands on the church, this spiritual force or spiritual conscription, if you will. Luke 16 also talks about religious persecution at the hands of the Romans. Citizens of Philippi, a Roman colonial city, what they accused Paul and Silas. And, because they're encouraging practices that are adverse to Roman customs. Luke 18, he writes of Claudius expelling Jews from Rome. And so we see this kind of spiritual, or perhaps spiritual - political conscription or coercion that's happening in Luke's day. And we see it now, right? I mean, we think of the political conscription that happens, with Texas and abortion laws. They think that it won't be long for there's an overturn of Roe v. Wade, this continued disembowelment of the Voting Rights Acts, this recent, allowing the Alabama to redraw and redistrict maps to limit Black voter access. We're seeing in some of these blue states, if you will, where mask wearing is becoming political fodder. So there are ways in which we kind of see this kind of political conscription that's even happening today. The challenges and, the ways in which our Muslim brothers and sisters are cheated. There was just a hostage situation in Texas at a Jewish synagogue. So again, we see this kind of spiritual, coercion and spiritual force, spiritual conscription that's even happening even in the 21st century. Simon of Cyrene comes into this context of physical force and spiritual force. And we see that even in our own context, that the divine calls, and do we have a choice, to go or not? What does it mean then if Simon is forced? Luke's epilambano, to lay hold on, to put one's hand on, to lay hold of Simon. Still that sense of force, coercion, compulsion, if you will. But what does it mean, St. John's, of Simon being conscripted to bear a cross, right? And so crucifixion, it originated with the Persians, but historians believe the Romans perfected it. Romans were notorious for subjecting rebellious slaves and those who were accused of sedition to crucifixion. It was the most wretched, the most heinous type of death, but it was also a class connection, that it was reserved for those within the lowest socioeconomic rung. Romans standardized the practice. They'd even get fancy with it, not just kind of the vertical and the horizontal, the kind of T shape, but they get fancy with it and even have it the X shape, the kind of St. Andrew's cross shape was employed. Interesting. It was really meant to be a spectacle. Crucifixion was nothing pretty, nothing subtle. The idea was that the government meant to send a public message that if you did what these people did, you would get what these people got. It was almost anonymous or analogous to lynching. You see images of lynching where people are gathered in their Sunday best with picnic baskets. How atrocious. And so this kind of almost festivity that was involved with lynching, that was the kind of regalia, if you will, involved with Roman crucifixion, spectacle and messaging, and this idea that, the shame and the embarrassment that the person had to endure and that their family also had to endure. What's interesting also about this idea of Simon being forced to bear or to carry a cross, notice what Luke says in Luke 9:23, take up your cross daily, take up the cross. In Luke 14:27, Simon doesn't take up his cross, right? He takes up the cross. Simon is forced to take up the cross that belongs to Jesus and wear behind Jesus or following Jesus, if you will. And so Luke, again, poking at the Roman government, even if subliminally or subversively. The cross represented brutality, political imperialism, social oppression. The cross representing human suffering and dereliction and shame. And Luke kind of redefines it, but yet it's still a kind of ugliness that's there. Simon, yes, bears this cross of redemption, not his own cross. It's not a cross of rebellion like one thief or a cross of repentance like the other thief, but perhaps Luke tries to, and I'm struggling with this, to redeem it, that it's a cross of redemption or buying back, but we can't get away from the conscription and the force. I think that, Luke wants to suggest that there's a Cyrenian who wants, I think, who would become this harbinger for us of our own, of America's history of slavery and forced labor, that Simon in Luke's day becomes this model, this prototype, this harbinger of compelled activity from the Middle Passage to these slave camps, these quote unquote plantations, to Reconstruction, to even the kind of nadir that happened post-Reconstruction, to the Civil Rights era. Simon, one of the African foreparents that Absalom Jones talks about, that Absalom Jones references, the Free African Society, the African Church at St. Thomas. There's something about a name, right? Jones and Allen were intentional of connecting their ministry to the continental motherland. Let us not forget this conscription of Simon of Cyrene, the hands of the Roman Empire. Simon as an existential harbinger of what would come through the hands of Absalom Jones. So what does it mean to be a cross bearer? To me, to be a cross bearer means that you shoulder, you carry, you bear on behalf of another. Remember, Anna Julia Cooper says Simon did it willingly. I don't know. County Cullen says there was some willingness, but yet there was some force. To be a cross bearer, it means that we may be displaced for someone else. And I'm not talking about no domestic violence or bullying, no, not bearing that kind of cross at all. What does it mean to be a cross bearer? It means that, yeah, sometimes our body may be put on the line in public for public good. To be a cross bearer, it means that we may be willing to put our ego in check. To be a cross bearer, that, yeah, we may need to get the vaccine for the greater good. There's that 3G, that, yeah, that good. That traversing to the good of the culture, traversing to the good of community. It means that, yeah, we have to be willing to humble ourselves, our mind, our spirit, submit our bodies, our physical being, that, yeah, we may have to, yes, pray with our feet and protest with our prayers. But sometimes we have to realize that we do this with the caveat that, yeah, sometimes it's the women who bear the brunt of this. Let's go to the next slide. And so how do we keep in mind what the Reverend Polly Murray and what she endured, what they sometimes people say endured, that yes, if we talked about Jim Crow, it was Polly Murray who says we have to think about Jane Crow as well. So there's no place for patriarchal posturing, that there's this taxation of women and girls, even in our faith. That in the name of Bishop Barbara Harris, no place for patriarchal posturing, that we have to think about, yes, the taxation that sometimes our faith even puts on our women and on our girls. Here's yet another G, that G of gender, if you will. Don't forget that as we tell the story of Absalom Jones, that he married someone named Mary Thomas. And you recall that he worked for years to secure her freedom first, and that it was 10 years, some say 14 years before he was freed. Yeah, that's cross-bearing. Cross-bearing, what do we shoulder? What do we bear? What do we burden? Amanda Gorman, you know, that new young poet laureate, has in her new book, Call Us What We Carry. It's what we do, it's what we sacrifice for the greater good. And so that final slide, and I'll call it a day. What does it mean to traverse to the good? What does it mean to be a cross bearer? What does it mean to die, to sacrifice? Part of the conundrum is, yes, those who are from the South, the KKK would burn what? They would burn crosses. And so I close with this. I grew up National Baptist USA Incorporated. I'm ordained Baptist, and I have ordination standing in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. But I grew up Baptist, and every Sunday during altar call, my pastor, Reverend W.A. Suggs, would lead the congregation in this song. Must Jesus bear the cross alone, and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. What does it mean to bear the cross? What's the cost? And what's the price? Simon bears, because in the end, Jesus dies on this cross so that God may be glorified. The floor is yours. And again, thank you so much, Kelsey, for doing this at the last minute. Thank you.
Did the Romans crucify women?
Yes, we don't talk about that a lot. It's not lifted, you know, and perhaps because if we're thinking about ways in which history is told, his story, right? H-I-S is always lifted. But yeah, it's a class issue. We oftentimes tend to focus on men, but absolutely.
When you were talking about bearing the cross, I know right now with Black Lives Matter and a lot of the things that have happened in the last couple of years, a lot of African Americans are saying, well, why are we always the ones that have to educate you? I don't feel I should have to educate you about what it means to be human or what my story is or how to speak or to address me. But in essence, that is bearing a cross, in the sense that a lot of people here don't either don't have the experience or don't care to empathize with the plights of others. I know recently, I guess it was this past week, the hostage situation that took place where 10 people got killed, and the armed gunman was taken into custody without incident. for him anyway. And somebody said that if he had been Black, he would have been killed. And that the police do know what they're doing. They are trained. They can de-escalate a situation without a lot of things happening. But when it comes to people of color, be they Black or brown, the outcome is always, it normally ends in death. And that seems to be, educating people about that reality seems to be our cross at this time.
I have 5 grandchildren. They range in age from 13 to 22. And with the older granddaughter, very, very bright girl, not just because she's mine, but a real internal thinker sort of woman, did ask me about the idea that our lives, Black lives, are not held in respect or are not say we seem to be expendable. My own conundrum over the years, and I've not resolved it yet, is that there are people living in the world that are comfortable hating me because of the color of my skin. That's been a question for me, I think, since I was pretty young. It's hard to believe that someone looks at my face and makes a decision about the value of my life and is casual about the taking of my life. I don't know who else's grandparents ever said this to them, but the word picnic came from, a Southern term, came from picking a Black man, a nig, picking a nig, bringing them to a location where they were having a celebration outdoors and lynching this man as a way of entertainment for their outside meal. Now, when my paternal grandparents, I can't remember whether it was my grandma or grandfather, told me that, I was horrified. I was not a child, though. I was probably in high school. So picnic originally was a horrible, horrible experience for some Black man was going to die that day that white community decided they wanted to be entertained while they were having a meal outside.
And then don't forget, it's etymological derivatives of like pickaninny, right? So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm responding a little bit to what you're saying, Deacon Margaret, but also some thoughts I've had. You kind of cause it to kind of spur a little bit more today, is that 2 things happens when someone from my community is picked to be crucified or to be burned or whatever the act's going to be. But we're traumatized as a group of people, but the perpetrators is not aware that they are being traumatized also, because they are experiencing something and they have to keep doing it to keep those feelings under trap. And that's one of the difficult things that are going on, this dual trauma that's going on, that has to be looked at and has to be dealt with.
To traverse means to move, to cross. One of the challenges, I think, that underlies all of the issues, problems, personal experiences, and the experiences of our lives is that there is obviously, we're talking four to almost 500 years later, we're having the same conversation about the same situation with the same people. Now, if I'm going to traverse something, I'm going to move from one place to another. just as happened with the story of Simon. Unless we are able to vocalize on every level about the tragedies that my fellows ladies have here spoken of, we're never, and I'm not a pessimist, I'm a positive thinker by nature, but I marched in the Civil Rights Revolution. A little Black girl of 17 years old. I was in college and I took a chance, but I was traversing. Now here we are in whatever year this is, 2022. And in many ways, I am distressed, not just because of my experience, but my parents' experiences and my grandparents' experiences. I have benefited greatly by the sacrifices of those who have gone before. And I'm going to speak up, but where are the other people that need to speak up? I'm talking about our white brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters. I don't really care where you came from. What I care about is whether or not you are traversing. Are you ready to carry the cross? And as long as we have people among us like the ignoble, I want to call him something else, but I'm in the church, Donald, you know who, Trump, who set a pattern for the continuation of the issues that we are all speaking about here today, we're never going to get very far. And I'll tell you, because this is a part of the fabric of where we are today. When you have states, as you mentioned earlier, who are taking actions legally, and I have a doctorate in law, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, who are willing to make it more difficult, as if it wasn't already difficult enough, for people of color, wherever it is you came from, to vote. We're going to have this conversation, and I'm quite frankly, I'm getting tired of it. I don't think that Margaret's granddaughters or anyone's grandchildren or siblings or sisters and brothers should have to go through this stuff again. And I don't see it going anywhere. We can talk till we're blue in the cotton picking face, but it's not going to make a bit of difference until you have the same group of people that went on January the 6th and tried to take over the Capitol in Washington. Can you imagine that the Republicans would say that this is orderly democratic discourse? I don't know where they went to school, but that's not where I went to school, and it's definitely not where I went to church. So I have a real issue. First of all, it needs to be dealt with on a different level. If we didn't have St. John's, and if we didn't have other churches of other denominations who are willing to take a stand, I don't know where we would be. Because just like Simon, somebody's got to take up the cross and stop talking over coffee and tea and do something more meaningful. Because the lesson for our children is not a good lesson. Not a good lesson. If I hear about one more young Black man being murdered for whatever nonsensical reason, I don't know what I will do. If I didn't have my church and my faith, I'd be at a total loss. And I'm one of the privileged few. I didn't come from a poor background. I've never had to sacrifice for anything. But I am really concerned about the future.
But, you know, what amazes me is white people feeling sorry for themselves. And I mean, I've always found it completely comfortable, you know. I mean, this thing where people say, oh, white people say, oh, we're the real victims nowadays, and people are discriminated against. Some nonsense, you know. It's just so odd. But I guess they just, I mean, it's like, I don't know, you know, my husband says, well, you know, it's about power and money. If you can get people upset all the time, then you can get money out of them, and you can, you know, get votes out of them and that sort of thing. That's all I can think of.
We're beyond our time that we covenanted with you for. But yeah, I thank everyone for sharing, and wonder if you might have some, if you could, you know, in the Episcopal Church, we talk about collects, you know, prayers that collect our thoughts. And do you have any sort of, not necessarily a prayer, but do you have any wisdom to collect everything that you've heard and maybe say something to send us on our way with? Also ending my sentence with a preposition.
I'll end with the verse. And as they laid hold of him, they grabbed him, one Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country into the city. And they made him bear the cross behind him. And so may the Holy One, who often, yes, conscripts us and compels us, may the Holy One give us the strength and the courage to leave whatever place of comfort, whatever place of complacency, so that we may go into the city, that we may protest with our prayers, that we may pray with our feet, till justice runs down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We go in the grace, in the strength, in the love, and in the mercy, and in the fight of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and in the spirit of Reverend Pauli Murray, and in the grace of Bishop Barbara Harris. Amen and Ashe.
Thank you so much for being with us, and hopefully our paths will meet again. I think you were a hit, and we'll maybe bring you back to be with us one more time sometime soon.
Absolutely,
Thank
my
you.
pleasure. St.
Thank you,
John's, take
Stephanie.
care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.